Great. I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Clay Odom, Associate Professor in the Interior Design Program here at the school. And it's a pleasure to welcome Olalekan Jeyifous. Olalekan Jeyifous is a Brooklyn-based artist whose work reimagines social spaces and examines relationships between architecture, community, and the environment. He's a graduate of Cornell University, where he received a Bachelor of Architecture, and is founder of the interdisciplinary studio OEJ, and is a founding board member of the Black Reconstruction Collective. His work has been exhibited at venues such as the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Guggenheim Bilbao, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Modern Art, where his artwork is featured in the permanent collection of the Department of Architecture and Design. Olalekan was awarded the notable Silver Lion at the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale, and is recipient of the 2021 Fellowship by the United States Artists. He's also a two-time New York Foundation of the Arts Fellow. A lot of accolades there. He's completed artist residencies with the MacDowell Fellowship, the Drawing Center's Open Sessions Program, the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, and the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center. In addition to his extensive exhibition history, he's spent over a decade creating large-scale public artwork for a variety of public spaces. For today's lecture, The Road Became a River, Olalekan will guide us through his discursive practice and unique professional trajectory, where art, architecture, and the potential of emergent technologies converge. It was a series of speculative urban fictions or speculations in the form of images such as Plant Seeds, Grow Blessings, which Olalekan created for MoMA's 2021 exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, that were the first works of his that I ever encountered. These works immediately thrilled me as polemics suffused with an overt and unapologetically narrative visuality, fecund intensity, and compositional complexity. They appeared effortless, but clearly were the result of intense conceptual and technical ambition, high design, and craft. In short, they were badass, and I still dig them for those qualities today. But as I looked, and I'm still looking, a more than visual quality emerged. Enmeshed in the image's vibrancy, I found a criticality of the status quo thinking, and a subversion of expectation, along with an invitation to examine closer. Was this an architectural vision for a future, a futuristic reflection of the past, or an emerging present? A fragment of an urban dream, at once real and imagined? Was it a mirror, a filter, an essay, or a storyboard for a film we really want to see realized? Those images and the work of Olalekan are all those things. His decidedly science fiction-infused art and design work spans subgenres as it critically weaves the utopian and the dystopian. In their active engagement, the works are at once complex critiques and celebrations of where we are and where we've been. There are markers pointing out the social, environmental, and technological exigencies of the present moment with seriousness and wit. As signposts, the works are, at least in part, tend to sit out there, near the horizon, beckoning to us, pointing toward the longer unfolding project and a richer, wider, winding river we, as designers, artists, architects, and people, can and must journey along together. I'm very happy to welcome Olalekan Jeyifous to the School of Architecture.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I feel like you'll have to email me it, because I kind of, now I want to tweak my artist statement, right, with some of the words. I feel you articulated it so well. It's great to hear perspective on my work. I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I want to thank the school for having me here. I'm really excited to take you through not only a handful of my projects, but also discussing my creative process, how I work, and kind of the unique trajectory of my practice, which in this case I've been working with this lecture title, The Road Became a River, Possibilities and Parallels. It actually references this quote by Nigerian author Ben Okri from his book, The Famished Road. And I don't remember the specific quote, but it was something like, "The river became a road," somewhere in there. And it's remarks on themes of kind of like rapid industrialization. So a lot in my practice, I kind of bring architecture back into the natural world and the natural fold through a sense of rewilding and kind of creating these holistic relationships between the built environment, the natural environments, community, and the ecological landscape. So it all began at Cornell in 1995. And I always like to mention this because as a Gen Xer, my architectural education literally straddled the digital divide dead center. So, we had an analog childhood in the 80s, entered college in 1995. The first 2.5 years were all drawing, chipboard models, sketches, so using line weights, thicknesses of lines, different types of construction lines to indicate, transparencies or depth or thickness, so it really shaped my sort of sensibility around approaching design and working with, sort of standard architectural representation in order to, illuminate my design and conceptual narratives. And then the second half was using the computer. So I really took to the computer around third year. And I mean, the beauty of it and why I think it's relevant as I discuss my practice is that, these were very early CAD software programs. You're looking at Form Z, which most of you probably never heard of. But there was no precedent for this work, It was all incredibly new. Specifically, rendering and visualization, was supposed to grant legibility to your work, was supposed to allow you to produce these very seductive 3D models of your design work in order to sort of articulate your ideas. But because there wasn't really a precedent or it wasn't fully established, I have always been fascinated by the sort of relevant potential for the computer software to articulate my own personal conceptual ideas and narratives, less so about producing legibility in the models. So I always like to show my thesis because it's a great example of both my conceptual approach to my kind of world building exercises, but also my creative practice and process, which still combines a blend of analog and digital ways of working. I try and breeze through this because just describing the cultural context can be long in and of itself, but it was titled The Abiku Phenomenon, and basically the Abiku is a Yoruba from Nigeria cultural belief that attends to when a family may lose more than 2 or 3 children in a row for whatever reason. It's believed that they are inhabited not by typically the ancestral spirit, which in Yoruba belief, every human being is just an ancestor returning to the world, but by an Abiku spirit, a childlike spirit that does not like the world because of all the injustices, the heartbreak, the what have you. And so they would turn to the spirit world as soon as possible. Long story long, that maps onto Nigeria's socio-political evolution in an interesting way, where this very core cosmological historical belief is considered a positive reflection. When you have an Abiku phenomenon in the context of Nigeria's gaining independence from colonial rule, it's a good thing. And the military coups, which may be a bad thing, but give opportunity to maybe course correct the country as it establishes national identity, is seen as a good thing. So it's at the core of it, it's this historical belief with a contemporary application. And I just used that as a kind of formal exercise to take, I built a model of the King's Palace, Oba's Palace, which is a very kind of historical, old, phenomenon in Nigeria, and then used quick paint, which is a rendering function in Form Z. And I know I'm getting real convoluted. There's never really any way to like parse this without getting into the weeds. But I mentioned this is all new stuff and there's no precedent, is that Form Z was this rendering function, quick paint was a rendering function in Form Z that did not render along the Z-axis or calculate along the Z-axis. So it would get everything correct on the Y, everything correct on the Z, but if you built a house with a front porch, it just would throw fragments of it behind and the back. It made no sense. It was the most ridiculous thing, right? There was absolutely no use for it. It didn't help you understand your model. But it was great for creating incredible glitches and fragments and pieces. And I found that to be a kind of very apt metaphor for, what the country did with this Abiku belief, which has a very entrenched historical context, but it's completely flipped on its end for this, contemporary way of reimagining it. So intentionally reimagining this 3D model, and then very messily with a million construction lines and smudges, because this is trace overlaid on the computer rendering, projecting it back in the plan, using that to create new forms. So I just did a series of these drawings. I kind of made a building somewhat in my thesis, right? Just to satisfy, certain faculty members, but it really was about this process, And it was, it was very interesting because, I feel Cornell was such an incredibly conceptual school. So they were amenable to, if you could sell, if you could sell the work. So of course we had very specific requirements, however many site plans, sections, elevations you needed. But if you could convince the faculty and the critics that charcoal on cardboard was what your project was all about, you could do it, but you had to sell it, right? So that kind of defined my approach. So I graduated in 2000, it's a 5-year program, and quickly decided that I worked for 4 years for a multidisciplinary firm, but I decided I wanted to be an artist and use my architectural education as the sort of lodestar of what my artwork would be about. So 2008, I was in this exhibit at the Kitchen in New York called The Future is Disruption. And I did this project called Adverse Speak in the Public-Private Program. And so it was basically taking the way we sort of play up brands and sell brands and exacerbating that and projecting it into the future and creating an entire financial and governing entity around this, how well you can sell and support these brands. And so because it was about kind of quantifying in a very tedious way in this incredibly bureaucratic world, my aesthetic was more in this sort of 8-bit kind of look and feel, in which, I was imparting an enormous amount of information about how this world operates. And so this is called the GAP map, the Greater Area Protocol map. It's actually a map of this new space and new society. And it's, sponsored by the GAP and all these corporations and how they sort of feed into this world. And so it's just a lot of detailed information using alliteration. The verbiage and language was as important as the imagery. So for instance, the 3SC2S, the sector, surveillance, service, central, and synaptic site was the agency that oversaw how everyone navigated this world. And so it was just a series of these large prints that really broke down how this world operated and sort of the rules. And we created this cryptocurrency. This was a collaboration between myself and my friend Maddie, who also went to Cornell, but he was, I think, in the arts, and he's a sociologist and historian now. So We collaborate often, and he is able to add critical rigor to my fun designs, right? So he really wrote actually pretty comprehensive historical narrative around this with all the founders. And so created this sort of cryptocurrency icon using the mandala and drawing on, you know, the way even the US dollar has an occult mythology around it, using the, you know, the pyramid and the E pluribus unum. And for ours, we used more of a mandala. And our quote was imperium sin fine, which in Latin is an empire without end. And so it's a diptych with a key legend that really broke down everything that went, you know, into this world. This world is occupied by residents who have to take an aptitude test to determine how well they're able to promote brands. And it's the 5AC, I can't read that, Q, but it's the average applicant aptitude for advocate candidacy. And so they take this form tree test and determines whether they land on RSR-0 to RSR-4. So if you're RSR-4, you can live like in these beautiful high rises in the center of this world. If you're RSR-0, you're kind of in the encampments and you have the menial jobs and what have you. And then each, you know, everyone wears a Bluetooth. And so how much money you make, your salary is determined by how well you perform on the, oh, I forget I have the screen right here. How well you perform on the construct to calculate quantifiable quality of adverse speak quotient. So how well you're able to promote a brand and elicit positive, neutral, or negative experiences by promoting that brand. So we just had a lot of fun with this. And just had a wall space. So it was like distilling an incredible amount of information and visual information into like what is essentially like a 12 by 10 wall in the gallery space. So that was my very early, now I'm an artist, but I'm kind of just an architecture student making my final thesis project, my artwork, so to speak. So I'm still figuring it out. Shanty megastructures for Lagos, Nigeria, I think is what propelled my career very rapidly and quickly, at least in terms of being able to live as an artist and not have to have another job. And it also combined my love of science fiction and world building with my interest in urban developments, socio-political economy, culture, informal settlements, spatial organization. So I was fascinated, and this is 2015. So I was really fascinated at the time with like massive urban scale development that was taking place all over the world, and how at best they ignore poorer, marginalized communities. At worst, those communities are considered eyesores, they're bulldozed, they're destroyed, and they're displaced. And of course, this isn't specific just to Lagos, it's all over. A friend of mine was doing a project in Chicago when they tore down all of their housing. You know, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. So and there's a fishing village in Lagos, Nigeria. And you know, Lagos is one of the most rapid and fastest growing megacities, right? On like in the entire world. And I think something like 65% of its population reside in informal and slum settlements. And so there's these massive development projects, but they're always luxury towers and what have you. So I wanted to respond in a way that acknowledged these communities and brought them into these massive future developments simultaneously as a critique of the kind of development that occurs, as a way of creating a sort of sci-fi architectural and visual aesthetic that challenged the kind of Western, which is always this very slick Star Trek glass and steel and metal and what have you, and why that's seen as technological advancement, right? So I used a lot of the sort of building typologies and materiality of the settlements, the organic ways that they evolve and grow and expand, and really created these renderings of them at this massive scale of the commercial developments. And then I did these renderings where I placed them into privileged areas of real estate throughout Lagos, Nigeria, where they're kind of growing and overtaking the streets and the landscape. And it was shanty megastructures for Lagos, Nigeria. And again, they're sort of evolving in this very organic way. And these are like SketchUp models. I downloaded the engine from, planes and rotated them vertically, reduced the number of polygons, and then skinned them with like very kind of local materials, and created them as sort of massive hulls that would hold these plates, that within these kind of plates would just be very self-organized and develop in a way where they would grow and be filled as needed. And so, they were originally set on the third mainland bridge, which connected Lagos to Lagos Island. It's a very important bridge there, as kind of like adding all of this new sort of urban development on this bridge that connected to the river. And again, just really chaotic and labyrinthine, but there's a logic to this, to the idea of informal economy and the way individuals engage with one another. And I also created a series of videos. I actually found what would be the antithesis to this kind of project, which was development of the Eco-Atlantic, which was just a kind of massive urban scale project that, I was responding to in a critical way. And so I found their promo videos, and everywhere there were like little outtakes of just like areas that Eco-Atlantic might expand to. I use them as underlays to input my own shanty megastructures, and I made my own promo video and then uploaded it to YouTube where theirs were as well, with the same like SEO keywords and everything. So people would look for their project, they'd see this, massive development here. So these are a series of stills. This project then kind of rolled into the African Mobilities exhibit by Dr. Mpo Matsipa. She put it together as a way to kind of organize a bunch of projects and workshops that really dealt with the continents of Africa in a very one-to-one way. So not a kind of top-down, paternalistic, I'm going to build a hospital, or, the usual ways of engaging with the continent, but really showing more nuanced, critical, inventive ways of, designing on the continents or producing creative artwork that was on the continent, but also shown to students on the continent. So I collaborated with a writer, Wale Lawal, and we created, I kind of told him what Shanty Megastructures was about and how I wanted to kind of move into the interiority of this world to really look at the individuals. And so he wrote 3 short, stories that I animated. This one was online, which is about kind of, and he wrote the story about in this world, it's illegal to be offline. So people go to these like little hidden community back alley kiosks to like shut down their smartphones, their what have you, and then go into a back room and wear these psychedelic masks filled with psychedelic drugs, which you can just get high and travel and not be online. The second one was Ominira, which means freedom in Yoruba, and he created an even more marginalized community outside of the shanty megastructures of folks who live in these shipping container villages. And this story is about a father and his daughter sneaking into these illegal fisheries to steal fish. And so it's an interesting story. Very dystopian, probably the most, actually, Dreamscape is the most dystopian one. So in this world, laborers are hired and they work like 18, 20 hours a day, and their only real reprieve from the relentless exploitation of their labor is that each of their single units are outfitted with an AI dream dream designer. So you can literally travel anywhere, live anywhere, be whoever you want to be while you're asleep. And it's called Dreamscape. And also you are euthanized after you've put in all of your hours. So this story takes place the last 10 minutes of this guy, Seconi Gomez. This guy, Seconi Gomez, is the last 10 minutes of his life when he tells the AI to send him to Mars and read revelations from the Bible in Yoruba. So that's how it ends. This was probably the most interesting one. And so we did these public screenings that were just out. This is Folomo Roundabout in Lagos. So we did these very cool public screenings. The Shanty Megastructure world scenes from these animations. We created like VR and had, you know, docents out there helping people put on the VR headset so they could really like get a sense of the scale. Because you can't really, I mean, you can see it in the rendering, but we really made it one-to-one scale in the VR headset where you can like see, wow, these really are mega structures. But it really was about engaging directly with the African continent and communities and schools there. The next iteration of this project, I was fascinated again by what the characters and what the culture looks like, and about you know, when I created this project, I didn't know what solar punk was until I gave a lecture at UC Riverside. And they're like, this is solar punk. And I was like, oh, and I looked it up and I was like, yeah, it is. And then I learned about salvage punk, which is about, and it was already in line with what I was thinking, but I didn't have the language. So I created a series of just these mobile vehicles and characters, either photographs I'd taken, my friends had taken, or just sourced from the web, where I'm outfitting them with, I'm calling them the capitalist excesses, like the capital detritus, the excess of capitalism. So a lot of my kind of framing is, and you presented in your bio, you know, is this a fever dream from the past? Is it the future? I've been much more fascinated with the idea of not like a futuristic world, but either a present world or a past world that could have occurred under a different set of conditions. And a lot of it is about using the things that we already have, not inventing like Star Trek and what have you. Really kind of, you know, we operate in this controlled obsolescence. So I have, since this project, been really developing a salvage punk aesthetic, which is much more about producing new and interesting tech, body tech, mobile tech that deals with, you know, the things we already have and the practices that we already are familiar with. And so I just did a very, you know, these are just, and they're very collaged. So I made, you know, I would do the little computer modeling, but then I'd print them out on like, I'd print them out, then I'd Xerox them and blow them up in the Xerox machine, and I'd make these like large posters out of them. And then ended up making them. They were never shown anywhere, except for me walking around Brooklyn, slapping them up on light poles and street signs. So a little informal gallery. If you walk around Crown Heights, you'll see a bunch of these different anarchonauts. And that is a portmanteau of anarchy and astronaut. The governing body of the Shanty megastructure I was calling the chaotic, anarchic, technocracy. And it was about, again, this sort of informal, informal exchange economy. And so these were really fun to play around with. I will pivot very quickly to some of my other practice, which is large-scale public artwork. It is how I finance my life as an artist. And I'm always trying to encourage artists to consider pursuing this either in addition to or you know, other than the sort of gallery career. So this is one of the earlier projects I did in 2019 in Grand Rapids, and it was called The Boom and the Bust, and it was part of the Across the Lines programming for Art Prize, which is one of the oldest, you know, public art programs in the U.S. And so I was really looking at the history of redlining, and, you know, discriminatory practices and kind of developing neighborhoods and black and brown communities in the area, and developed this project called The Boom and the Bust, because there still is such a, and again, this is all throughout the US, there's a massive issue with kind of homelessness, and then there's a alternate narrative, at least in Grand Rapids, because in the downtown area, there's tons of like economic development. So that's the boom, but the bust is that the statistics that map onto individuals, black folks in the area, is that there's a lot of housing loss. There's a lot of buying up of private property by either foreign firms or out-of-state firms that are creating blocks out of them, driving up the housing prices. And there's a lot of homelessness or semi-unhoused situations where folks are living out of their cars or in hotels. And so my site was downtown. I had a sort of small footprint, so I decided to create this vertical installation. So these are early sketches where I just wanted to visually combine the idea of like massive, large-scale developments with the sort of negative statistics around housing and home ownership in the community. So I was calling it the boom, of course, and the bust. So I was using this language of almost a sort of brutalist, large-scale skyscraper building, then bifurcated by these smaller red homes. And red typically indicates a sort of negative statistic. So this is how they came together. It was kind of pieced together on sites. And again, I was really using, the sort of the construction language, raw materials, exposed beams. Because for me, at least in New York, when there's a lot of development, that's when it's most visible that the neighborhood is changing, when there's a construction shed up and when there's scaffolding, and you'll be walking around your neighborhood and it'll be that way for like 5 to 10 years. And then all of a sudden that scaffolding comes down. And it's like the new building is just there, It's kind of like this night and day experience of, what's coming, and then all of a sudden it's there. And so it was 25 feet tall and an 8x8 sort of footprint of aluminum, steel, and these little painted red buildings. So you see a little bit of that detail there. And it was in the downtown, very close to where a lot of, new developments, new quote unquote mixed income, housing is being made, those kind of like brick and barn style lofts you see. Another project I did, public art, was in Alexandria, Virginia, and it was called Rot, Knit, Labors, and Legacies, and it was part of the Site C program for the city of Alexandria. And so, and this is the King Street waterfront, so there's like this massive kind of waterfront park and plaza where artwork would go. And so they do a new artwork every year. And I think I was the second person, and this was 2020. And so if you don't know, I didn't know at the time, Alexandria, Virginia had the largest domestic slave-owning firm in the United States. And if you're like me, we learned so much about the Atlantic slave trade, but very little about the domestic slave trade of, arriving in this area and slaves being shipped back and forth between the North and the South. And it's such a beautiful, quaint area, this old neighborhood. It has these like cobblestone streets and all these little artisanal cheese shops and cafes and antique shops and everything. But right in that area, in a beautiful 2-story building, is the one of the with the largest domestic slave trading office. And so for me, it was just fascinating again how there's a lack of interest in confronting this terrible history as very much entrenched and part of American history. So it's not like you have American history, then you have slavery history, and they're separate. But usually, it's it's articulated in that way. And so Alexandria, Virginia was built up by a variety of industrial, commercial enterprises, of which slavery was absolutely one of them. So it was wheat, barley, tobacco, human beings, were very much a part of that. But then also, it had a very sort of rich freed community as well, which was very much responsible for how Alexandria is today. So I wanted to create a way to acknowledge that history, and so I made these 4 large silhouettes of just generic black characters with these iron, sort of wrought iron aesthetic, because you see a lot of that in the gates and the windows and what have you in the neighborhoods nearby, that had this kind of iconography and symbolism that reflected the sort of 4 major commercial practices that were really responsible for, making the city what it is. And yeah, they were up there for like 8 months. And at night, they were facing the Potomac River. I hope I'm saying that right. I always want to say Potomac. And it had these, solar LED lights. So they were very low lit, so that this like silhouette, kind of this stark silhouette, was very visible in the evening. And so that's sort of what it looked like at night. And then it was installed literally 2 days before the pandemic and a complete shutdown of the world. So I never got to visit it myself in person, but there was so much, interesting IG photographs taken. I could kind of like look on IG with the hashtags and see everyone engaging with it, or either, having their little cute dog there, take a little pose picture. There was information that described, what the sculptures were about. So you could learn as much as you wanted to, have more of a direct engagement or a passive engagement, what have you. So it was a very interesting project. It was moved to a kind of personal, a semi-permanent location in a nearby neighborhood, and now it's being moved again to its permanent location. Regeneration was a project I completed last year in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And it was for the North Side community. They're doing a lot of development in the neighborhood. And they wanted to create this sort of like landmark beacon that brought you in, landmark beacon / gateway. The state butterfly is a monarch, and they had the Monarch Cafe nearby, and there's like a Butterfly Creek nearby. So I really wanted to create something that referenced the butterfly, but not really directly, but also as a way of kind of creating these 4 zones that reflected, the sort of health, environments, housing, and job kind of creation that's really trying to be part of the growth of this community. And so I worked with a lot of community stewards, and had a lot of conversations, and then began to put this project together, sort of this seating area, again with these 4 zones, with this design on the plaza, that again reflected these 4 zones that reference, again, health, environment, job creation, and education. And so that's what it looked like. And yeah, so it had a kind of large, massive central pillar with an astrolabe. I forget what that compass ball is called. I have a little distance from this project. But yeah, so there's a glow because it's the North Side and the North Star, so it's illuminated. I brought back the butterfly because even though it's on the nose, it's something that the community felt very strongly about. They loved the imagery. They loved seeing it, it's representations of change. And so I created kind of like this butterfly wings. Again, it was illuminated. And then these, 3 lanterns, again, that had these interesting masts that reflected the things that the community was important to, the things that the community found important. And so, yeah, it was a blend of kind of this interesting design on the plaza, referencing again the nearby creek. And these, zones of seating and gathering, they would also hold events there and celebrations. So this was, this was a really exciting project. And again, public art, doing the world building and a lot of stuff being digital, public art is a way to reconcile my architectural background in a very built one-to-one way, and really create these moments that are at sort of full scale. So back to the sci-fi futuristic world building. This project I started, again, right around the pandemic. This was early studies for the installation that I created for the MoMA exhibit in 2021, Reconstructions, Blackness in America. 12 architects were invited to focus on a city and create a kind of response to that city. And so I selected Brooklyn. And during the pandemic, we're all grounded and we're all kind of walking around and we're, making sourdough bread and doing all that. I feel like America, at least New York, turned into like a small European village during the pandemic. Everyone's kind of walking around, sidewalk cafes, drinking open containers, enjoying al fresco dining. But we also saw a lot of the kind of protections that we've been told our tax dollars were there to support, really the pretense of that not really come through, right? And so I began to think about what if communities just focused on a very, communal, self-sustaining practices. But first I began by looking at these spaces and creating like green enclaves within them. So this is literally on my roof looking across the street at the kind of air gap space between the building across the street and then building up, these sort of, this is called Bodega Eco Haven, as a kind of rewilding of Brooklyn and what I'm calling the vanishing urban ephemera. I've lived in Crown Heights for like 24 years, and I've seen the neighborhood rapidly change. A staple of what the community looks like is like the storefront churches and the bodegas. But even as the neighborhoods get gentrified, they get bodegas that you've been so familiar with. They've been getting these facelifts to these really like weird, clean, ultra sanitized looking like green grocer kind of Whole Foods on a smaller level looking thing. So in doing these kind of works, I've been very interested in preserving that like raw bodega storefront church look. Because they're not just stores where you can buy, cigarettes or tampons. They're actually like community, like very strong community sensors. Same with the storefront churches. They've really kind of overtaken or taken responsibility for a lot of social services. But I've also been interested in, just reimagining this kind of lush, verdant world where produce and fresh water can come front and rear. So this is on my roof looking back towards the sort of entrance onto the roof. And I have this large like aeroponic, drone delivery food system working, sort of freshwater pond as well, with someone beating the heat. And then, just started creating these little rendered moments. Again, this is me looking at a different vantage point onto my roof, creating these kind of rainwater harvesting and rain filtration systems that attach to the facade, and these kind of massive rain gardens as well, and these delivery drone portals where this fresh water is captured and delivered by drones to different apartment buildings, different areas throughout the neighborhood. And these are all photographs taken literally like on my roof a few blocks away. So this is just 2 blocks down the street. A scrapyard that I then again turned into this aeroponic, aquaponic, sort of farm, again with these drones where they can pick the different produce and then travel and deliver them and distribute them throughout the neighborhood. Looking at kind of like an alleyway, created this, what I'm calling the bubble farm, where in these kind of like little climate controlled bubbles, food food or other kind of vegetation that is not specific to this particular climate or neighborhood can be grown. And then the last kind of concept was making these sort of digital kiosks, teaching centers out of subway cars, because the sort of guiding logic of this world that I called the frozen neighborhoods. Again, this was a collaboration with my friend Maddie, who I mentioned. I collaborated with the Average Speak, the first project I'd shown. We came up with the frozen neighborhoods and the idea that in the mid-70s, the government enacted legislation to curtail greenhouse gas emissions by creating mobility credits that would determine how far, how often, and how frequently individuals and groups could travel. And Maddie had it like connected to sort of free trade markets. So if you were rich, you could buy tons of mobility credit and maintain your like discursive traveling the world lifestyle. And if you were poor or came from poorer communities, you could pool together and sell blocks of your credits to then create enough capital to just decide, okay, we're gonna just focus on our community and not travel and be sort of closed off. Hence the frozen neighborhoods. I'm reimagining then roughly like the mid-90s, you know, what the community has developed in that time. And so I've made this sort of like really verdant Shangri-La of, you know, massive communities, these sort of freshwater corridors. And this was also an aerial my friend sent up his drone and took pictures. So I always start with like an underlay and then really build up from that. And so I had two sides of this wall. So again, I'm presenting a lot of information in kind of a small space. So I had a series of these detailed renderings, these interested sort of abstracted sculptures, a 3-channel fly-through that really showed you what it was like to be in this world, and then an example of the new subway kiosks. Because now, because the subway cars are no longer mass transit, you know, vehicles, they're now these like small buildings where you can go there to learn, you can go, you know, calling centers, job centers, religious services. So the maps no longer articulate where the subway cars are going, but what services are being provided on that day. And so again, incredibly detailed, an enormous amount of information, you know, seasonal occupancy maps, you know, just a whole bunch of different information. And again, using the language of the bodega and the storefront. I actually took a picture of a bodega a few blocks away from where I live, and swapped out all of their advertising and all of their window signage and posters with just information that explain how this world works. And so this was like the kind of massive key legend that really broke down everything else you were seeing. So if you look at the Welcome to the TFN regional occupancies, they show kind of stable neighborhoods with the flooded neighborhoods. And that was like a Budweiser sign, the red one, and the blue one was a Bud Light. So literally just replacing all of these different, you know, signage with detailed information. And then created a series of renderings, really diving into this world. So the MTA is no longer the Metropolitan Transit Authority. It is the main threshold access. And so I actually went to the LIR substation in East New York and took pictures in one of their kind of old buildings, and then made this very detailed rendering imagining that there's a series of coders and hackers who run remotely all of the technological and digital systems out of these substations. So everything from, you know, the patterns the drones fly, or the watering patterns for the aeroponic system or aquaponic systems, to, all of the information inside of the subway cars. So this is what a standard subway car would look like now. And I assigned different, the ACE was lines that ran in certain areas of Brooklyn and the city, but now they refer to the types of services. So ACE is African, Caribbean, Europe. So it's just kind of calling sensors where you can contact your family and, talk with them through these VR headsets, almost like you're there, because again, these folks are isolated, in their communities. And so again, just series of rendering, articulating even more. So the Crown Pro wetland intersections. So I made a lot of the main thoroughfares and arteries, these flooded freshwater zones. I made a lot of the storefront churches and all the different religions. In this world, they really got together and created this interfaith seed bank. So the plant seeds grow blessings, Brooklyn interfaith seed vaults. So they really preserve the kind of, seeding, and again, delivering them throughout the community. Really just showing this like immersive world, deploying, again, all the way back to shanty megastructures, that very, informal economy, sense of self-sustainability, and again, environmental stewardship as well. And so, yeah, I just had these different renderings, a Franklin Avenue shuttle, Gateway triple stack, and then the East New York Greater Gateway. So East New York has these elevated tracks, and it's kind of like a very large main station there. So I made that almost like the central headquarters. It's almost like a sort of university in a sense. And this is a 3-channel fly-through. So leading to the Venice Architectural Biennale last year, I did almost the exact opposite for my idea around the frozen neighborhoods, where mobility credit was, almost this limited, locked-in, apartheid kind of condition. I created this world, alternate world, called the ACE and the AAP. And the ACE referred to the African conservation effort and the All Africa Protoports. And this takes place in 1X72. So I've started taking from Murakami's, I don't know if you read or heard of IQ, 1Q84, where, it's an alternate world, and that alternate world is indicated by the Q replacing the 9. I did that with the X. So 1X72 is how I've been indicating that it's an alternate timeline and not a futuristic world. It's a retro-futurist world. And so it took place, again, in 1X72, roughly a decade and a half after the majority of West African countries gained independence from colonial rule. And I imagine that in this trajectory, colonial rule was completely ousted, and of course all the exploitative resource extraction things that determine the genocides in Sudan and Congo are no longer the sort of natural resource curse that the continent and countries on the continent face, but they pursued this pursuit of alternate energy sources and developed the All Africa Protoports, which became their piece de resistance of the African conservation effort, which were massive travel complexes that were located throughout 12 major port cities throughout the world. So Havana, Kingston, Los Angeles, New York, Barranquilla, Port Said, et cetera, et cetera. And it takes place, and so my installation took place in the 13th Africa Protoport, which is no longer in a coastal city, but is in the Barotse floodplain of western Zambia. And so it was also rooted in this area and during this time of like the golden era of travel, you know, the early 70s to the late 80s. So my mom is Black American from DC and my dad is Nigerian. So I was born in Nigeria, but I would travel frequently back and forth between Nigeria and where my mother's parents lived in Washington, DC. And so I remember flying and travel very well. It was so exciting. There were like these airlines, KLM and British Caledonian, you know, and you could go in the cockpit and the service was so much more robust than it is now. And back in those days, you could put a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old on a plane in Lagos and fly them to America by themselves. We did that numerous times because the flight attendants would look after you. And then when you land in JFK, the flight attendants would be assigned to walk you to the gate to fly to DC. So, which is pretty wild to think of. You know, I have 9-year-old twin niece and nephew. My brother's like, I wouldn't send them 2 blocks down to the store right now. But so I did really a series, so I just had this immersive, you know, space. And I created these technical systems illustrations that really broke down how both the technology and kind of organizing systems operated for these very proprietary technologies that constituted the All Africa Protoports and the sort of, you know, incredible invention of the African conservation effort, as well as a series of these, you know, renderings from these scenes. So this is a suborbital launch. One of the technologies was a suborbital shuttle system that was activated by, you know, these shuttles would be in an algal drift pool and they'd go into this magnetic lev launcher. So it's rocketless propulsion that would shoot these shuttles into a low orbit so that you could go from like Lagos to Los Angeles in 2 hours. And then this is an aerial of the Baratsi floodplain of the newest All Africa Protoport. And this is the kind of Havana algal drift pool launch. And so I'm very meticulous when I do installations. So on the right is the rendering, and on the left is the rendering, and on the right is the actual installation. So anytime I'm giving these, like I make very detailed models, and I texture it, and I build it up, and I make it, because I need it to look almost exactly as it's going to look, you know. And I'm working on the computer, but it really came out, you know, exactly as I intended. I don't like surprises. So, you know, everything is almost exactly as it is. So it featured, you know, this kind of seating lounge with this massive 20-foot LED wall that was serving both as a window out into the various tarmacs and launch points of the different All Africa Protoports, as well as a kind of abstracted video essay that really articulated how this world operates. And, you know, I don't like to be too didactic, but I do like to let people understand what's going on and what the rules and parameters are. And as you mentioned, the bio, it won the Silver Lion. And I always feel like, you know, I was telling you, Clay, about, you know, when I'm doing public art, the secrets is doing the night shot. I felt the secret was like, you give the critics some place to sit. Because I think who won the golden one, they also had seating. Because they're walking all around the Biennale between these 2 sites. They're tired. And so I was like, you're going to be able to come in here and sit down and get comfortable and take it all in. And, you know, the furniture I made intentionally oversized because I wanted it to feel, you know, like, so I'm a 3-year-old to a 6-year-old when I'm flying back and forth. So I wanted to create that same kind of experience for folks who were, you know, there. I had these really interesting collages as well. But I wanted people to like sit in them and have their legs dangling off the edge like they were little 5-year-olds. So they're like more massive. But it was really much, and so yeah, these are a series of, again, just people uploading, you know, pics to Instagram. If you see, there's Norman Foster, and he's strolling through being like, this isn't architecture. He just kind of like walk right through it, didn't even look up. But yeah, so this is just, you know, I really made this immersive space where people can sit and take in the world. The video essay kind of articulated everything that was happening. I had these like what I would consider vintage site models. I was, you know, the renovation of LaGuardia Airport, which was like a which was like a Greyhound gas station bathroom for like 25 years until they did this massive renovation, and they took, you know, one of the, you know, they really refurbished and revitalized, you know, one of the areas there. And so they would have these little vitrines showing, you know, the history of flight and what have you. So that was kind of the idea with these scale models and these sort of 3D printed vignettes that I had dotting it. And I think we're at 6, right? Probably time for Q&A? Yeah, all right, let's do it. Thank you.